Most people think medieval warfare was chaos. No rules, no records, no system. Just armies clashing in fields until one side ran out of men. That image is wrong. Behind every medieval war, behind every invasion, every siege, every campaign, there was a financial machine running quietly in the background, tracking money, moving funds across enemy territory, accounting for every coin spent on soldiers, weapons, and food. And the methods they used? Some of them are still running inside the financial systems we use today. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand where modern money systems actually came from, the hidden history most people never look for, support the channel by subscribing. It helps us keep making these. Now, let's go back to the Middle Ages. Before you can track money, you have to raise it. And medieval generals were far more sophisticated about this than history gives them credit for. The most obvious source was taxation, specifically war tax. When a kingdom decided to go to war, a portion of the taxes collected from across the country was earmarked directly for the military campaign. It was calculated, allocated, and distributed with a level of bureaucratic precision that most people would not associate with the medieval world. Sound familiar? It should. This is essentially how defense budgets work today. But taxation alone was never enough, especially once a war was already underway and the army was deep in foreign territory, too far from home to wait for funds to be sent from the capital. So they improvised. When an army defeated a territory or forced a state into surrender, one of the standard peace conditions was tribute, a fixed payment of money or resources flowing from the defeated party to the victor on a regular basis. This was not looting, it was institutionalized. The tribute was negotiated, documented, and enforced like a contract. It gave the conquering army a steady stream of income to sustain ongoing operations without constantly having to draw from back home. In effect, the defeated nation was financing the next phase of its conqueror's campaign. Ransom. This one is where the medieval war economy gets genuinely surprising. When a high-ranking individual was captured in battle, a nobleman, a bishop, a knight, they were not simply killed or imprisoned indefinitely. They were held for ransom. And this was not some informal, brutal process. The ransom market in medieval Europe was a sophisticated, institutionalized system, complete with its own brokers, its own regulations, and its own established norms for how negotiation should proceed. The captured knight's value was assessed. His family or allies were contacted. Terms were negotiated. A release price was agreed upon. And here is the detail that almost always surprises people. Prisoners in this system were typically treated well, because a dead or injured prisoner was worth nothing. A healthy, unharmed noble was worth an enormous sum. So captors had a direct financial incentive to keep their prisoners comfortable. One English soldier during the 100 Years' War was reportedly captured and ransomed 14 separate times over the course of the conflict. 14 times. He was essentially a recurring revenue stream. As the medieval period progressed, a more formal financial infrastructure began to emerge on the battlefield. Military orders, organizations like the Knights Templar, and merchant banks began providing war loans, sometimes in the form of physical currency delivered to the front, sometimes in the form of financial documents, early versions of what we might today call letters of credit, that could be redeemed at another branch location in a different city or territory. This was cross-border financial transfer, operating in the 12th and 13th centuries. There were also arrangements where wealthy individuals would contribute large lump sums to a military campaign in exchange for titles, privileges, or land grants from the crown. Essentially, you could buy a lordship by financing a war. And then there was the method that required no negotiation at all: looting. When every other financing option had been exhausted, or when an army's morale needed a boost, generals turned to plunder. Cities were sacked. Monasteries were stripped. Civilian wealth was seized at sword point. It is worth understanding why this was so prevalent. Military salaries in the medieval period were genuinely meager. The base pay for a foot soldier was rarely enough to justify the risk of dying on a battlefield. But the promise of plunder? That was different. That was real, immediate, tangible wealth, available to anyone willing to fight hard enough to reach it. Plunder was not just a financing method. It was a recruitment tool. Generals who could not guarantee their men a share of the spoils struggled to keep armies together. The ones who could kept fighting. If you're finding this fascinating, the hidden financial machinery behind history's biggest events, consider supporting the channel by subscribing. Every subscriber helps us keep digging into these stories. Because now we get to the part most historians gloss over. Once the money was raised, how did they actually track it? This is where medieval financial history gets genuinely remarkable. The accounting methods developed during this period were not primitive workarounds. They were elegant, practical solutions to real problems. Problems that would not look out of place in a modern finance department. The most widespread accounting tool in the medieval world was a piece of wood, specifically a tally stick. A notch cut into a wooden stick represented a numerical value. Different sizes of notch represented different amounts. The system was simple enough that it could be read and understood by people who could not read a single written word. This mattered enormously in a world where literacy was not widespread. But generals needed something more than just a record. They needed a record that could not be disputed. So they developed the split tally stick. A single stick was carved with the full record of a transaction, the amount, the parties involved, the terms. Then the stick was split lengthways down the middle. One half went to the payer. One half went to the payee. If anyone later tried to alter or dispute the transaction, the two halves simply had to be matched. The grain of the wood, the precise cut, the notches, they would only align perfectly if both pieces came from the original stick. It was tamper-proof, and it was so effective that the early Bank of England issued stocks using the split tally system centuries later. In China, a near-identical system emerged independently, using bamboo instead of wood. Same principle, different material, different civilization. Two separate parts of the world arrived at the same solution, without any contact between them. That is not a coincidence. That is the power of a genuinely good idea. For more complex transactions, the kind involving military orders, merchant banks, or formal agreements between armies, a more sophisticated document was needed. Enter the chirograph. A chirograph was a written agreement produced in 2, 3, or even 4 identical copies on a single sheet of parchment. Once all parties had agreed to the terms and the document was signed, the copies were physically separated, cut apart using irregular, jagged cuts called indentures. The irregular cut was the security feature. No two cuts were identical. So if someone later produced a document claiming to be one party's copy, it could be verified instantly by checking whether its torn edge matched the other copy. A forgery would never align correctly. One of the best surviving examples of this system comes from early 15th century England, a document confirming a financial agreement between King Henry V and the army captains who supplied soldiers for the Battle of Agincourt. The paperwork for one of the most famous battles in English history. Still intact, still readable, centuries later. Now here is the detail that feels most modern. Medieval armies needed to transmit financial information across vast distances, between generals in the field, treasuries back home, and banking contacts in foreign cities. They built a messenger network to do it. These were not ordinary couriers. Medieval financial messengers were highly trained specialists who combined geographical expertise with the discretion required to carry sensitive financial documents across hostile territory. Many operated as freelancers, available for hire to whoever could pay their rates. But kings and high-ranking nobles maintained their own private messenger services. These personal couriers were salaried, had their expenses covered, and carried official royal decrees that granted them legal protections and passage rights in foreign territories. Think of them as something between a FedEx agent and a diplomatic envoy. They moved money, not physically, but informationally. A document carried by a trusted messenger was as good as the funds it described. In the medieval Arab world, the messenger system took a different form. Carrier pigeons. During the period of the Crusades, a regular pigeon mail service operated between Baghdad and Damascus, carrying financial documents, military intelligence, and administrative communications across the region. The Arab world of this period was also significantly more advanced in mathematics than much of Europe, conducting formal financial audits using algebraic methods that were centuries ahead of Western practice. Modern algebra, in fact, has its roots in exactly these accounting traditions. The financial record-keeping practices of the medieval Islamic world were not a footnote to history. They were the foundation that later European mathematics was built upon. And then there is a method from the opposite side of the world that has no parallel anywhere else in history. In pre-Columbian South America, the Inca civilization developed a recording system called Quipus. Quipus were arrangements of colored strings, each string tied with a specific pattern of knots. The color of the string indicated the category of information being recorded. The position and type of each knot represented a numerical value. No writing, no clay tablets, no parchment, just string. And yet the system was sophisticated enough to track taxes, military resources, census data, and financial obligations across an entire empire. When you compare a quipu to a tally stick, separated by an ocean, produced by civilizations that had no knowledge of each other, the parallel is striking. Different cultures, different materials, different contexts, the same fundamental need to record value in a form that could not be easily disputed or forgotten. Every accounting method we have looked at today, the tally stick, the chirograph, the messenger network, the quipu, was solving the same problem. How do you track wealth when there is no universal system? How do you create a record that cannot be forged, cannot be disputed, and can survive the chaos of a military campaign? The medieval world found answers that were more sophisticated than most people ever imagine. And those answers did not disappear when the Middle Ages ended. The split tally became the basis for early banking instruments. The chirograph's indenture system shaped the development of contract law. The algebraic auditing methods of the Arab world became the language of modern mathematics. The messenger network evolved into international banking correspondence. The systems we use today, the ledgers, the contracts, the transfer records, the authentication methods, all carry the fingerprints of what was built in the medieval period. The world changed, the problems stayed the same, and the solutions, centuries old, still work. Subscribe to Hidden Wealth Files for more deep dives into money, power, and the hidden history of the systems that shape the world. New episodes every week. There is always more beneath the surface.